Today we're going to be talking about Molder, an American death thrash metal band from Shorewood, Illinois. This is following their brand new album, Catastrophic Reconfiguration, that was just released. Molder is new to the scene. They started in 2017. They have 3 albums, and I have the vinyls for every single one of them that I'm going to show you today. Molder is a 3-piece band which consists of Dom Vaya on bass, Aaron Pansky on vocals and guitar, and Kaiya Pelletier on drums. Now, Molder is a very promising old school death metal revival band. They have a modern death metal sound that's very similar to bands such as 200 Stab Wounds and Skeletal Remains, but with a little bit more southern obituary twang to their sound. If you're a fan of legendary death and thrash metal bands such as Obituary, Pestilence, Possessed, and Death, then I highly encourage you to check out Molder. In 2018, Molder began recording live performances of their shows and would eventually release audio to one of these performances on a cassette tape and promote it as a live album, which was called Live at Cobra Lounge. Following this, Molder would release their An Act of Revenge demo on cassette tape, which was recorded in Aaron's basement. Many of these songs from the demo would make it to their first official debut album titled Vanished Cadavers, which was released March 20th, 2020. This album was released early due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was still quite an unfortunate month to release your debut album, but I guess better late than never, right? Vanished Cadavers would feature 11 songs and is just over 34 minutes long. The tracks God's Critters, The Sweet Taste of Death, and An Act of Revenge were all taken from the original 2018 An Act of Revenge demo. So let's talk about Vanished Cadavers from 2020. First impressions for this album, the vocals are very similar to John Tardy from Obituary and some of Chuck Schuldner's vocals from Death. I was also really surprised by the guest performances on this record. You have members from bands like Melting Rot and Sanguish Sugabog on here, and the tracks are total bangers. There's also heavy bass that I love, especially in the title track, Vanished Cadavers. There was also an unexpected movie sample that I really liked. It ends with a woman saying, "I'll give you something to remember for the rest of your life," which just goes really hard in the moment. And she says that right before the music starts up again, which I thought was really cool. That song is also featured on the An Act for Revenge demo, and that is one thing that I noticed about all of the songs that featured movie samples. They all came from the demo. So you also had that in the song God's Critters. There was another movie sample in there, and that is also from the demo. There's also a little bit of hardcore elements with this, so they are a death thrash band. There's definitely crossover in here, and I really like it. It's a very nice mix. So imagine like John Tardy's like southern guttural vocals under death thrash hardcore style instrumentals. It's very, very cool. The thrash elements are definitely more in the guitar tone for sure, but it's still a very good sounding record. Act of Revenge is a standout track for me. There's a dual guitar solo in there that's super heavy that also features these kind of like deicide style vocals. They're very ghoulish. Best tracks for me off of this record are Granulated Chunks, Sweet Taste of Death, the title track, Ritual Killings, but for sure, Act of Revenge and Necrobiome, they slap. Those are the best songs off the record for sure. In terms of how the album flows, I would definitely say it's pretty straightforward. The songs are stacked pretty well with their own heaviness that kind of just gets progressively heavier as the album goes on. There's not a lot of instrumental diversity, I will say, and I think that that's like the one negative with it. There were other reviewers that kind of talked about that as like one negative for the record, but it's really not terrible because the highlights for this record are definitely the vocals for me and the guitar tone. The rhythm section is also bringing a lot to the table with this record as well. It's a super fun record. It makes you want to move, and I really, really like the hardcore death thrash elements that they're playing around with on this record. Then we get into Engrossed in Decay from October 2022. This album had a very interesting beginning. It kind of fades up with this warbling sound effect, almost like a cassette tape, that's stretched too far and it warbles the music. That's kind of the vibe that you get when this record begins and when it ends, which I really liked. It reminds me again of 200 Stab Wounds in terms of the ambient instrumentals that they had on their new records. That is what I thought was really cool. The vocals are still very, very strong. They're more guttural and they're more messy, but in a good way. So it's almost gore grind in a way with how guttural it is, but still John Tardy style. Very, very catchy songs on here, especially with the first track, A Gluttonous Remains. Super catchy. Again, you get that hardcore crossover thrash sound with this record. It's definitely more amplified on this album than it was with the debut record, so you do get more of that crossover thrash, but I listen to a lot of hardcore death, thrash crossover bands, especially from Japan. So this is totally up my alley. The vocal sample that is used in Relentless Pestilence reminded me a lot of the movie Resident Evil, which I just watched recently, where, there was a contamination in some sort of lab. So the sample is very similar to that whole concept, that whole scene at the beginning of the movie, which I don't know why it reminded me of that, but I was like, yeah. I also really like the song Huff the Stench, which features these drums in the beginning that are kind of tribalistic, and it really is kind of like a little mini drum solo, and it's also the first track on side B, so it's an awesome way for them to start side B. I really like it. There's a really great build up for it. Felt like this record was very balanced, very well paced, and I just really like it. Cask of Maggots is an absolute banger as well. So as far as the album, how it flowed, it's very quick, which is ironic because it's longer than their debut record, but it feels like it goes by like that. So very quick flowing record. There's a lot more instrumental diversity on here, which I did enjoy. It's definitely felt more of like a polished record, a more well-balanced record. The production and the mixing was louder. It just seemed like they really amplified and corrected the mistakes that they had. They amplified their sound and corrected the mistakes that they made in their debut record. And now we're going to talk about Catastrophic Reconfiguration. This is Molder's brand new album that was just released in November 2024. I have to say this album is absolutely a contender for album of the year. I know many of y'all are probably going to put Blood Incantation on here. I would argue that this record could be better than what Blood Incantation had, specifically because this album and this band is just so incredibly promising with that OSDM revival sound. This album is better in production. It is just old school death metal all the way. It absolutely sounds like a record that you would get in the 80s. It literally sounds like an album from the 80s. It's very impressive how they were able to accomplish that with this record, and I've really only had one other experience with a band where I felt like, upon the first listen, I was like, this is, from the 80s or whatever, only to find out that it was actually a more modern band, and that was with Power Trip. Like, Power Trip is the only other band. I thought that they were from 87 or something, and now it's like they're from 2011 or something like that. But anyway, you get the same effect with Catastrophic Reconfiguration from Molder. There is less hardcore elements on this record, and it's definitely more focused on that southern Floridian twangy death metal sound. I mean, it is 100% Obituary worship, but in the best way possible. That is up my alley, girl. Like, Obituary is just This record sounds like you know, buried it in the swamps and it was festering, and then, you know, a crocodile ate it, and then it puked it up, and then it's just raised from the swamp, and it's just this festering, moldy, gutturally looking thing. Like, that is what that record sounds like. It is fire. Absolutely love it. Some of my favorite elements for this record is the experimentation with these deeper gore grind style vocals that are accenting different lyrics. I really, really love gore grind and grindcore. If you've been watching me for a while, that's kind of my genre, but I just love gore grind vocals. I love the gutturals. I love how gutturally they can be, and the accents that they had with those kind of gore grind vocals for some of their songs were really, really good. It's not like replacing the main vocal style. It's just like an accent that's layered on top of his main John Tardy style vocals, and I really enjoyed that. It's a great layering piece. Super slow, groovy death metal track. I mean, this record is just low, slow, twangy, you know, and it's just everything you want with like southern death metal. I really enjoyed the title track that opens up the record. I also liked the song Pulp. I'm absolutely obsessed with the main riff from their song Overdue Burial. I thought Frothing, again with those guttural layerings, were awesome. Masked Mold, awesome. The rhythm section for this record is just crazy good, and every single one of these songs, the production, the mixing, it's absolutely a more polished and well-rounded record. It's very solid. Like I said, it's heavy, it's groovy, there's riffs, great old school Floridian style death metal, and it's a lot more diverse than their second album. So if you're definitely looking for that kind of obituary worship in your newer death metal bands, I would definitely say check out Catastrophic Reconfigurations from Molder, because their entire discography is just honestly really, really impressive. You have all different kinds of vibes. As I said, you have a little bit more of the death thrash crossover, just a nice even blend of all of that on their first record, Vanished Cadavers. You get a little bit more of the hardcore crossover thrash sound with their second album, Engrossed and Decay, and then they just full on devoted more of their attention to that southern old school death metal obituary style with Catastrophic Reconfiguration. And they're really one of the only bands, in my opinion, one of the only newer bands that have been able to capture a true old school death metal sound. And the only other newer band off the top of my head that I can think that really accomplished that this year is Skeletal Remains. I mean, that record is definitely more Cannibal Corpse in its sound, you know, whereas Catastrophic Reconfiguration is more obituary, but that was a very solid record, and that was very, very much, you know, true old school death metal in my opinion. Let me know down below what you thought about this new Molder album. Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Have you heard anything else from Molder? I would love to hear your opinion. I hope you also enjoyed looking at the vinyls, because those are just absolutely beautiful. And yeah, I hope to see you in the next video. Take care. Bye, guys.